Hi friends, it's Paisleyandglue, and today we're going to be talking about bias tape. Bias tape is one of my favorite things. I find it very satisfying to make. It can get a little complicated with all the little fiddly bits if you cut out these strips by themselves and try to sew each piece together. You can totally do that, but there's a nice trick that I'm going to teach you today about how to make continuous bias tape that you can cut kind of in a spiral so that you don't have to stitch anything together at the end. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to turn this into this. So the first thing you need to do is to decide how wide your bias needs to be for your project. So that can really vary depending on what you're doing and what you're making. So there's a couple different things you can do with bias. This is just a piece of bias with no folds and nothing done to it. This is a piece of single fold bias. This is a piece of double fold bias. And this is some piping. So all of these things use bias strips. So when you're making bias, always remember that you're going to need some sort of seam allowance probably for whatever you're doing. If you're doing single fold, you just need how wide your strip will be finished plus a little bit of seam allowance. This is commercially made bias tape, so to conserve fabric, their seam allowance doesn't go to the middle. Usually I will have the bias at least somewhat butt up in the middle. So you're going to be looking at least a 1/4 inch seam allowance, if not a little bit more than that. Double fold bias tape is on a fold, obviously. So that's usually going to be used if you are binding something off, like so. So you need the finished width times 2, since there's a fold in the middle, plus your seam allowance. For piping, you need to account for how much circumference the cording inside the piping has. So this is a pretty small cording, so it's probably 3/8 of an inch, and then plus whatever your seam allowance is. This is again commercially made piping. When I make piping, I like it to be a little bit wider, usually 5/8, so that I can butt it up against the seam allowance of whatever my project is. Just makes stitching it together a lot easier. So once you have that amount for your width, then you can calculate how much yardage you need. I'm going to be making, I think, 1 inch bias tape and 2 inch bias tape today, just for ease of cutting. And I sort of had these pieces of scrap fabric already, so I'm just going to make as much as these allow. I'm not going to go into the equations needed to do this. They're not hard equations. I'm going to put them in the description so you can look at them, because it's just easier once starting to talk about math and then everything gets all screwed up. So the first thing you need to do is, if you have a square piece of fabric like this is, you need to find the bias. And the true bias of the fabric is on a 45-degree angle. You have your warp and your weft of your fabric, which is the weave direction. And the true bias is going to be on the true 45-degree angle of that piece of fabric. So on a square like this, that's just going to go from corner to corner. So that's pretty easy. I like using these quilting rulers because if you have a straight edge, you can easily find your 45-degree angle by matching a corner of your quilting ruler and then the 2-inch line also with this straight edge here. So that's finding a 45-degree angle along this line. And I can go ahead and trace that. Okay. And then go ahead and cut on that line. And now we're sewing right sides together. You're gonna sew the 2 pieces together so that your diagonal bias edge is along that line. Looks a little like a flag. So we're going to go ahead and stitch along this line. I'm going to put this aside for a minute. Now this is a fat 1/4 of quilting fabric, so it's 1/2 yard this way and 1/2 of the width of the fabric going this way. So the way we do this is, we want to make bias out of all of this. You could just make this into a square and do it the same way I just did the other piece, but that's gonna waste this little piece of fabric. So we're gonna fold these edges so that they butt up here. Mark this corner here. And then this is the line that we're gonna go on. And again, matching this corner and matching the 2-inch line is gonna get me that true bias 45-degree angle. You're always going to be wanting to work on the back side, so when your line gets a little off like that did, it doesn't matter. Again, cut along that line. And then this is going to end up here. So what we want is a parallelogram. So the bias edges are parallel to each other and the top straight edges are parallel to each other. Right sides together. So we're going to be stitching this seam like so. Okay, I'm gonna go and I'm gonna stitch these seams at about 1/4 inch and I'm gonna press the seams open and then I'm coming back. Okay, so now we have 2 parallelograms. One is bigger than the other one. But now we can go ahead and start drawing our bias lines on here and get ready for cutting. So you wanna make sure that you are tracing parallel to your bias edge and not your straight edge. This is the one I'm gonna do 1-inch bias tape on. So this is where your quilting ruler comes in handy. I can follow the 1-inch line here and go ahead and draw this all the way down. Okay, have that one marked. Now for the larger one. And this one I'm doing 2 inches, which is nice and easy because this ruler is 2 inches wide. Okay, so now we have our lines drawn on both of our pieces. Put this aside for a minute. Last step before we can cut it apart is we need to sew it into what is going to be a tube so that we have continuous bias. So we're going to bring together our bias edges like so. So this makes a little bit of a square. So this is a bias edge, bringing that to a middle. And then this is a bias edge, bringing that to a middle. So your lines should be matching up going this way. So that's sort of the hard thing to fold it in the right way. Now, if we just sewed it together like this, we would just cut out a series of circles, right? So we need to offset this by 1 line so that you have one coming off this way and one coming off this way. And this means that when we stitch this line together, when we cut, it's going to end up being a spiral and everything is going to be one long continuous piece of bias. So I'm going to match these lines. And remember, you're sewing it at 1/4 inch seam allowance, so your pencil lines will be offset slightly. On this one, it's the same idea. We're bringing our bias edges to meet each other and then offsetting by 1. Okay, so we've got our 2 tubes ready to go, ready to be cut apart. Unfortunately, you can't really do this easily with a rotary cutter. So I'm going to use shears here, and you just cut along your lines. Okay, that is going to do us for today. I've got my 2 big chunks of bias tape that I made here with the continuous method, and I got a little bit more than 5 yards of this one and almost 5 yards of this one. So you can see that it doesn't really take that much yardage to get a lot of bias tape, and I hope this trick helps you make it a little bit faster. See you next time.